Now, for more on this, so we can speak with Damon Wilson, a Executive Vice President of the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much for joining us. And rather, I should say, Damon Wilson, thank you. I would like to ask you for your immediate reaction. We've got Iran and Russia that say that these strikes violate international law. Do you agree with that?
I very much disagree with that. I think there's only a touch of irony in arguing that airstrikes in response to the use of chemical weapons violates international law. I think we have to recognize that what's happening in Syria is devastating to the rules-based international order and international law. And unfortunately, because of Russian diplomacy, they've neutered the United Nations' ability to address that. And so these airstrikes, in many respects, are the best means to uphold the sense of international law and a rules-based international order.
Now, do you believe that this, for the moment, what we're seeing from the White House, that this marks a change in policy, or that this is simply a one-time event that's meant to deter President Assad?
Look, I think what we see, this is a very significant signal, both in the context of the Trump administration's approach to Syria, where there were a lot of looming questions in the wake of the campaign about what kind of role the president would take. And I think faced with the reality of a situation, the use of these chemical weapons, which in many respects was a blatant violation and test, the president came down decisively on what steps to take. So while this is a one-off in response to this scenario, I think it very much does augur for what is likely to surprise some of those skeptics and critics of the United States, that President Trump is likely to exert a lot more leverage to have skin in the game and to play a more significant role in the outcome of what happens in Syria.
Now, you say that you do not believe that this violates international law, but what about U.S. domestic law and the speed with which this was carried out? What do you make of that?
You know, I think in a situation like this, where much of the international community was questioning whether the United States had the will, not the capability, but the will to help play a role in which we would hold together the principles of a rules-based international order that are built on the back of things like the prohibition of chemical weapons, where that had been cast into doubt. The speed with which the administration acted, I think, was meant to send a very clear signal that resolve should not be questioned, and the United States will do what it needs to uphold this rules-based order that recognizes there are issues domestically in terms of the White House's consultations with congressional leaders, which I understand took place, key consultations with allies that took place also in advance, which I think is important to ensuring that international support. Look, in an ideal situation, we would have a UN Security Council resolution that would authorize this internationally. Everyone knows the reality that Assad's protector in Russia would block that. And so rather than just be neutered with inaction, I think the administration took the right course. Domestically, I think they're on strong grounds, knowing that this isn't an opening of a new campaign or a full-scale war, if you will. It is a discrete, proportional reaction in response to what took place with the attack. And I think through congressional consultations, this all falls within the War Powers Act. It's if this were a military action to continue beyond 60 days, it would require much more congressional approval. And that's not where we are right now.
What does this do then in terms of relations between Moscow and Washington?
Well, I think this is, in many respects, the Russians had seen this coming. What they thought they were going to get in the election of Donald Trump, when they sort of overtly intervened in our own American elections to tip the balance away from Hillary Clinton. I think this is the end of a very quick disillusionment among Russians, where they thought they might get a better deal, if you will, with President Trump. And seeing the national security team that the administration has assembled, a very mainstream and relatively hawkish national security team, this sends a clear signal of the limits of what Vladimir Putin's going to be able to get away with and not provoke a U.S. reaction. It's time that there be some pushback to Russia's actions, and it's started here with their client state in Syria.
We've heard from several EU leaders, including the leaders of France and Germany, saying that President Assad brought this upon himself for the use of chemical weapons. However, they continue to insist on resolving the Syrian conflict through diplomatic means, concerning the United Nations, bringing that in terms of any resolution. But of course, we just saw yesterday the UN Security Council once again failing to act. Where do things go from here moving forward?
So I think most Americans, and certainly in the administration, I think would agree that you do want to use diplomacy. You do want to use a UN-brokered process to provide a peaceful outcome and a transition in Syria. But I think the reality of that, think about the reality of the hard politics. Who brings leverage to the table? You do not get a negotiated settlement in Syria if the United States is out of the game. If the United States and its allies have no leverage on the ground, how are we going to have leverage around a conference room table? We haven't. And that's been painfully apparent by the fruitless negotiations that have taken place up to now. If, however, the United States is able to demonstrate that, yes, we will have some leverage on the ground through our special forces, through our cooperation with our allies like France that want to shape the outcome on the ground, as well as the willingness to stand up to the most egregious actions, as we saw in response to Assad's use of chemical weapons, that changes the power of the negotiating game, and it gives some leverage that might give a better chance to diplomacy. In the absence of this action, you can kiss diplomacy goodbye. But if the United States invests some effort on the ground, it might actually give diplomacy a chance here.